and thank you so much for joining us. I'll introduce the three of us in just a second. Hopefully you're here to join Simone and Wendy and me in excavating a bit the synergies and the tensions between, on the one hand, engaging people in work to bridge their differences and begin to heal toxic polarization, and on the other hand, pursuing equity-based elements of a social justice agenda, especially racial justice. I'm David Eisner with Convergence, an organization that sits at the intersection between bridging divides and solving key problems. Our flagship Convergence dialogues bring leaders together across some of America's deepest political, ideological, sectoral, and other divides. And we do that to build trust, find common ground, and identify consensus solutions that are actionable and equitable, and that address some of America's most intractable public issues. Today, we have a huge subject in front of us, a short amount of time, and two extraordinary leaders to guide us. Steve, maybe we can get rid of the slide. Wendy Feliz brings 2 decades of experience in public policy and advocacy to her role as the founding director of the Center for Inclusion and Belonging, which houses the signature culture and narrative change programs at the American Immigration Council. Wendy and the center also convene institutions and individuals nationwide who share the common goal of building a more cohesive America where all people are welcomed and included. Wendy serves as an adjunct communications professor at Georgetown University and holds an MA in public communications from the American University, a BA in liberal arts from the New School University, and an AA from East Los Angeles Community College. Simone Washington leads the DEI practice for Business for Social Responsibility, bringing more than 15 years of experience in leading equity initiatives with some of the nation's leading social justice organizations and mission-led corporations. At BSR, Simone helps companies create fair and equitable access to opportunity for all stakeholders in their value chains. Through consulting, collaboration, research, and thought partnership, Simone uses equity-based approaches to work with BSR members to advance diversity, inclusion, and systemic change. Simone is a former civil rights attorney and trained conflict resolution practitioner with a master's in negotiation and conflict resolution from the Warner Institute, Creighton University School of Law, a law degree from Cumberland School of Law at Samford University, and a BA in political science and criminal justice from the University of South Alabama. Now, before we jump into this discussion, we thought it would be fun and useful to conduct a quick poll of participants. It will ask you to choose which of 3 statements are the closest to your perspective. And I'll admit, it's also a bit unfair because each of the 3 statements is somewhat absolute and non-nuanced. So we're asking you to just select the one that's closest to your perspective, even if you don't fully agree with it. Here are the, if you can put the survey up so folks can see it. Here are the 3 statements. Overcoming America's toxic political divides should happen before we can address issues of equity and justice. The second statement, addressing issues of equity, social injustice, and structural racism should occur before we can overcome America's toxic political divisions. And the third statement, advancing equity and justice and overcoming toxic polarization should be pursued simultaneously. So A, political bridging before equity and justice, B, equity and justice before political bridging, and C, the two at the same time. We'll give people maybe 30 seconds to fill out the poll, and I'll wait, Katie, for you to let me know that we've got the results published. So, Katie, can folks see the results? So I'm assuming that folks in the live stream are seeing the results. Simone and Wendy and I aren't able to see them yet. But let me turn to Simone and Wendy to kick us off. And as we're in this conversation, I hope that at any time folks will feel free in either the chat or the Q&A to ask questions, which we'll then see, and hopefully we'll be able to address some of them. Simone, would you help us start with some definitional guideposts? What do you see as the essence of bridging work? What do you see as the essence of racial justice work? And feel free, if you'd like, to share anything that was not in the introduction about what your organization does, and any thoughts you may have about the poll results.
Sure. So when I think about bridging work, it's really being able to have those hard conversations and practice grace and give space with people who may not see the world the same way that you do. And this is really the heavy lifting. And one of the things that is really part of my own professional mission is to make sure that people are equipped to have those conversations. I've noticed that a lot of times we just jump head first into the very heady and difficult and intractable topics, and we don't know how to navigate that. And so, being able to make sure that people understand what it means to be engaged in active dialogue, to me, is a large part of bridging. And I would also say being able to hold space and practice grace. And when I say that, that means if you hear something that may be triggering to you, or that's something that's the polar opposite of your belief system, being able to just listen, and not listen to respond, but listen to understand, I think is a big part of bridging, and creating safe spaces for people to do this work, and recognizing, it's not just emotional safety, it's also physical safety that allows for us to do this bridging work. In terms of racial justice, I don't necessarily use the term justice because that's such a broad sweep and that's really our North Star. I tend to couch this more along the lines of racial equity, being that my race shouldn't be the determining factor of whether or not I can succeed in this society. And so how do we start to, one, identify those barriers, both present and historical, and then collectively figure out ways to deconstruct those barriers? And I think that's where bridging comes in and plays a very vital role in the conversation around racial equity. And then for me, professionally, in the work that I'm doing at BSR with my team, is really getting beyond identity politics. And that's not to say that your identity and the many identities that you hold are not important, right? Because they do shape our reality. But like, if we're talking about what the future holds for us, if we're talking about this pie in the sky concept of justice, that's where we need to start with the conversation. What does justice really look like? And I always use this metaphor, and I'm a pop culture fanatic. If we were in a Walgreens world at the corner of happiness and health, what would that look like for everybody? And then being able to say, based on my identity, how easy or how hard would it be for me to move into this utopia or this utopian vision? And then the other piece of this is really trying to help people move away from quote unquote the fight, and to take their collective imagination and energy and think about what is the system or the world that we actively want to create together. That no one faction, no one institution, no one community is going to be able to do it alone. And again, that's where the bridging piece comes in.
That makes a ton of sense, Simone. Wendy, how would you respond to the same question? How do you definitionally look at the bridging work? How would you define that distinct from the justice and equity work? And in the meantime, feel free to share anything about your organization that I may have missed, and also if you have any thoughts about the poll.
Thank you, David. And it's great to be on a panel with both of you. I love listening to Simone, but I'll get some in and then I'll give it back to her. Just by way of background, I work at the American Immigration Council, as David said, which is an immigration law and policy organization based in DC. So for 30 years, we worked to ensure the just treatment of people who move to this country, but we also work at the level of culture and community building because we believe obviously good laws and policies are a must, but they have to be coupled with community conditions that ensure newcomers and longstanding residents feel safe, that they can thrive, and that they feel like they belong in their communities. So I wouldn't say I started off as a bridger. I would say I was mostly focused on rights and justice and equity for immigrants. But I think over time, I've become increasingly a bridger. So I kind of hold both of the identities, I think, of being a social justice advocate, but being a bridger. And I think that's because after more than a dozen years of working on immigration justice, it's become very clear to me that there are many who benefit from keeping us divided on the immigration issue. There's much to be gained politically by using immigration as a wedge issue, and I'm not interested in replicating or emulating, those forces in any way. John Powell always talked to us about breaking and bridging, and I think breaking is what they want us to do in order to avoid us being able to build our power together across communities. These forces want us to distrust one another, to believe that there's not enough to go around, and to think other groups are our enemies, and that what we need to do is break from others so we can keep what's ours. And I've seen this all the time. This 3-decade long, quite frankly, battle for changes to our immigration laws is colored by something we all know as zero-sum thinking. And in this case, it presumes, and a lot of Americans presume, if an immigrant gains something, a person in the US loses. And I think this zero-sum thinking is what's gotten in our way of real change in this country. And I think dividing up by group and fighting over what we believe is scarce resources has built a scarcity mindset in us. And I think the way we come out of this and come to a more abundance mindset is when we bridge with other groups and we build our collective power towards change.
Thanks, Wendy. Just a quick a follow-up on that. When you think in terms of the folks that are interested in wedging and the idea of not breaking, but bridging, the example that you gave was folks that see people coming into the country in a way that if they achieve something, it's taking away from others. Do you see that on the other side as well? Does it feel to you like this is counsel and a position that you're promoting in both directions, or does it feel like from the immigration issue that this really is about folks that are less excited about immigration making those, creating those challenges?
I mean, I think to be very fair, polarization happens when two sides are unwilling to see the other side's point of view. And so could I say that the immigrant rights movement is free from zero-sum thinking? No, certainly not. Could I say that the immigrant rights movement doesn't bridge as much as they should? I think that's a fair statement. And so I do think polarization is something where two sides are kind of not seeing each other, and it takes a little bit of two to tango. So I definitely don't place the blame on one side or the other. I just think we've gotten further and further away from being able to have actually rational discussion. And we start to assume that people who don't agree with us are absolutely against us and have become the enemy. And I actually don't think that's true. I actually think there's a lot of complexity and gray area in the middle. And if we would actually get back to talking about this, I know we could come up with solutions. It's happened before. But the problem is there's more benefit in keeping us divided on this in the mind of very powerful people, right? It's a really great political wedge issue. It's a really great way to get people to vote for you when you divide them up over this issue. So we have to figure out how to overcome those forces. Some people call it the polarization industrial complex, or whoever you want to blame. But I mean, I think it is actually real people solve problems all the time. They do it every day in community. And so we really have to get back to that level of, I think, contemplation and negotiation rather than just leaving it up to, national voices to try to solve this.
It seems like a lot of people in the audience are also feeling a real imperative around both the equity issues and the bridging issues, with more than 3/4 saying that these should be pursued simultaneously. At the same time, we're seeing conflict and tension emerge, and some of it's been around for a while, between these ideas of bringing people together across differences on the one hand, and on the other hand, engaging in pursuing a justice agenda. Can you, Simone, let's start with you. Can you articulate where you see those tensions and how they play out, and the kinds of concerns that you think are appropriate and legitimate from either perspective about the challenges of the two agendas coming together?
So I think as a starting point, we have to acknowledge kind of like the historical context of this. When I think about the bridging community, it has largely been homogenous, and a lot of it has, and this is not to say that this is accurate, but the perception has always been that it's to maintain the status quo. What I know to be true about justice movements, especially today, is that we can't maintain the status quo, right? We have to find that nice level of change to push things forward. I think the tension comes that when you live one of these marginalized identities or underrepresented identities, is that there's always a present sense of urgency that we can't wait for everyone to come to the table and be on the same wavelength to create change, right? And that also an incremental stance on this work is not going to be sufficient, especially in this day and age where when you look across equity or equality indicators, we have a big schism between those people who have access to power and people who do not. And so there's this sense, this tension around, we have to do this and we have to do this now. I would also add to that, and going back to my original statement, being able to trust people whom you have not necessarily had the best relationship with to do the right thing is a huge hurdle to cross. And so, just to take it to Wendy's example, I would be hard pressed to convince, say, an immigrant rights organization, I've had this experience in real life, to come to the table and to drop more or less the advocacy stance and really, try to build relationship, given the fact that most times when you're coming to the table, you're still dealing with those issues in real time. And so there's a little bit of a balancing act that has to happen when we're trying to bridge with parties who are diametrically opposed. And I want to go back to a comment that Wendy's initial comment around polarization, and use a very old school conflict resolution term called schismogenesis, right? This idea that we've gotten so far on opposite sides of the pole that now we reside in our echo chambers. If we can't break those echo chambers, which I think is really our work as bridge builders, then, and I'm not saying this from a stance that all hope is lost, it's just going to be that our work is that much more difficult. With the rise of social media, with the rise of being able to say, you know what, I'm going to create this algorithm where everyone thinks and says the things that I do and reaffirms my reality, that makes being able to hold space for other people's realities that much harder. And so that to me, I think is the biggest tension in the room. And that really, coming from my 9 to 5 perspective, that's something that the tech sector, I think, plays a huge role in. And if we're thinking about how, as bridge builders, to push this work forward, maybe that's one community that we want to tap into and really, hold their feet to the fire as we try to create change.
Thanks, Simone. Wendy, where do you see the tensions and that are legitimate and that cause concern on either side about bringing these two agendas into full alignment?
I really agree with Simone. I think that the tension exists on a couple of levels. One, I think, if I just speak specifically about the folks who work towards immigrant rights, I think they're tired, they're frustrated. The last 4 years, particularly, or 5 years, have been incredibly painful. The refugee resettlement sector was completely decimated. Things that have happened at the border have been unconscionable. It's a humanitarian crisis. I mean, it's very hard to say to people who are on the front lines doing this work, hey, we got to bridge with you who disagree with us, And so I think that's why the communication is so hard. And so I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, I've had these conversations a lot where people say, we don't have time to wait for you to build a more perfect union, Wendy, where people can solve these problems. We have a chance to pass a bill. And I say, good, go pass that bill. If we can legalize streamers, go pass that bill. Don't wait for me. But what I'm worried about is the reality is this November will be 35 years since we passed comprehensive immigration reform. And 11 million people live in this country without, access to basic things like driver's licenses and social security cards and the ability to work and live freely. And so I think I'm happy for people to do short-term work, defensive work. I think that's important. I'm happy to build a long-term strategy that I hope will make us better off in 10 or 20 years, because immigration is it's a cyclical thing. And people will continue to come. This whole world is changing. The climate is changing. Climate migration is just beginning. So if I can keep working on the long-term strategies of building a nation that is excited when immigrants come, is happy, and wants to ensure that they have everything they need to succeed, and that I can build that strategy out with other groups, because lots of groups need the ability to succeed, I think we'd be in good shape. But I think that is the tension, that people are just tired. They're frustrated. They're hurt. And it's a struggle to get them to think about, but where do we want to land in 20 years? Let's try to figure this out and come together. And so I totally get the tension and I respect it. And I don't think everybody has to do it. I think some people can do the defensive work. People can go to court. Some people can go down to the border and defend the rights of people to seek asylum. And some of us can work to bridge divides and build back bipartisanship, because I don't know how we get big, broad legislation if we don't.
So it's really interesting between both of you. We've sort of got two essential tensions. One is this tension where historically the bridging work has actually been implemented as a way of pausing progress. Let's wait till everybody's in the same place, and then we can move forward. Has been a refrain that we've seen over and over and over again as civil rights and other justice issues have moved forward. We also are hearing that that actually there are real difficulties in moving an agenda forward, as Wendy was saying with immigration, without the kind of without the broader support and without breaking down some of these barriers, which you've posited as probably a big piece of why we haven't had progress, the kind of progress we should see in immigration for 35 years. What if, let's ask the question, what do you think the bridging community might do to help assure folks that that bridging in this space is not about trying to hold the status quo, but is actually about trying to bring people to better understand each other, including some of the imperatives for improving people's lives, and that there's no intent or challenge, and that we're working to sort of break this historical framework where bridging means protect the status quo. What do you think bridgers need to do to help provide a different kind of assurance to the justice advocates in a way that still allows us to welcome everybody into the bridging space.
So to kind of borrow from the godfather of bridging, John Powell, one of his theories is something that I use a lot in my work because we find that, even in the corporate sector, there's such tension and apprehension about building relationships across identities and sectors and, different power dynamics. And I feel like, to borrow from his theory, targeted universalism, I think the role of bridgers, if we're really going to do this work and do it with some level of meaning, is being able to paint the picture of the future, right? What is the upshot, or what is possible if we actually work together collectively, right? And then how do we back into that? Recognizing, to Wendy's point, that all of us are operating in different ways within, quote unquote, this movement to create systemic change. But our job is really to paint the picture, to really think about, if we're talking about transformation, what does that actually mean? Transformation just can't be this concept or this word that we toss around. And so our job is to use bridging as a way to drive transformation. And for me, I'm an adherent to Grace Lee Boggs. Transformation is really about using your imagination to think about what's next and what's new. We are, in so many ways, as bridge builders, able to do that because we hold space for differing perspectives and being able to build consensus based on those perspectives. And so, if we're going to break out of this mode of being people who are perceived as maintaining the status quo, we have to actively and explicitly say, this is what the future holds for everyone involved if we do this the right way.
Wendy, do you have thoughts on other ideas for how the bridging community might both be welcoming to a very broad set of people and to help signal to the justice community that this is not a status quo game?
Sure, I have a lot of thoughts. I agree with everything Simone said, so I won't add to that. But what I'll say is, I'll take it in a little bit of a different direction. I tend to live in a place of hope and optimism because my last name is Feliz and it's required of me by birth. But also, I think that if we work our way back from political violence, which is a real possibility and it's already happened. So if you work your way back from that, right, which is the state we don't want to end up in this country, where that becomes a more common thing, identity-based violence, political violence, things like that, which happens and is a real threat. If we work our way back from that's a lesson about why bridging is so important. Those things are made possible because the people don't see each other as human, right? We see men killed on television, we see people attacked, and the persons who are attacking them doesn't see them as fully human. And so there's a real danger across groups that this growing dehumanization is taking place, right? That somehow these are less than human beings and they don't get the same rights or the same dignity as others. And so if you think about that imperative, what bridging does, and it doesn't have to be where you go and have a tough discussion about, don't always think of it as that way, have a tough discussion to figure out immigration. Sometimes bridging is activities and communities that allow people to get to know each other and humanize each other. Because we increasingly live in these sort of siloed communities and homogenous communities. Everybody looks like us, everybody sounds like us, everybody drives the same kind of car. And so we start, because we don't know each other, we start buying into the myth and misinformation that's being fed to us through the media, through things like that, right? The National Science Foundation came out with a study not too long ago that said primary evidence, so firsthand experience, is almost the most important thing for bridging divides, because what's happening is people are hearing a lot of misinformation and they're assuming that's truth. And so I need firsthand experiences to know that's not true. So if I'm personally in a place where I see a certain group as less than my group, the only thing that cures that is actually knowing each other and having opportunities to connect with each other. That could be through school activities, it could be through church activities, but like it really is incumbent on civil society, on community-based groups to build bridges between communities who don't know each other, because the outcome is actually could be much worse than we are right now. And where we are right now isn't great, but it could get worse and it could get more dangerous and it could get more violent. So I kind of also think about bridging as literally saving lives in a lot of ways. And I don't think it's dramatic to say that because I think we've seen it again and again.
The anti-violence outcome from bridging is really critical. How one of the um, questions that's in the chat from Sarah Watson is, how should advocates think about the decision of when to compromise and when to hold fast to their ask? This, for me, implicates one of the most important questions about bridging, which is, do people need to come into a bridging conversation thinking that compromise is what they need to do, that, or do people, is the idea that people need to come into a bridging conversation purely from the perspective of understanding the other person without feeling like by entering the bridging conversation, they need to figure out where to compromise?
So I'll take a stab at it. I don't like the term compromise because I feel like that means that there's a zero-sum game and you're having to give something up in order to move forward. As a practitioner, I always come in with the mindset of how do we augment the pie? How do we think about all the possibilities that are able to bring to bear in this conversation before we make a decision, right? And that lends itself not necessarily to compromise, but to consensus. Right? I'm going back to the space of imagination. I know it may seem esoteric or trivial, but I can't stress enough your ability to think beyond the boundaries of your current situation or the limitations of the circumstances that have been put in front of you, whether it's via echo chamber, whether it's a sense of urgency, and being able to break out of that and think about what are all the possibilities and all the multiple ways that we can figure out how to move forward. That's a much different way of going about this work. And to kind of echo what both you and Wendy have shared about bridging, that only comes through relationship. And so initially, you shouldn't come in wanting to necessarily push an agenda. You want to come in to figure out, how do I understand and better relate to the person who's going to help me lift this mantle and carry it forward? And so it's not going to be solved in a limited number of conversations. Dare I say, this is the ongoing work. This is that stream of work that will never end. But it's really, again, the idea of, once I know you, once I feel comfortable with you, how can we crack this open together? To really think about what's going to benefit the both of us.
Wendy, you bring a really interesting perspective to the same question that Simone was just talking about, because you really come to it as an issue advocate, where you've got very specific goals that are important from your organization's perspective to move forward on in terms of success in the area of immigration. How do you manage the duality, on the one hand, of having a real agenda that you want people to embrace, and then going into a conversation with people that will have a different perspective? Do you start from a position of trying to get them to change their minds or to compromise? Or do you bring a more, let's say, traditional bridging perspective that the key is building relationships and the content happens later?
It's a great question, David. I think the question that was asked is really feels to me about politics, and politics is a zero-sum game, and it's really hard to get anybody to think of politics in any other way than a zero-sum game. So I think that's a real challenge. So I pick my battles carefully. Let's put it that way. And I think again, I think if we can win policy, I'll take it. If I can legalize dreamers or essential workers, I'll take it. And I'm not going to slow anybody down. I'm just not, because we've waited too long. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that affirmative work. And if I can get people to do it a little bit with me, I'll say jokingly to people, like, what if you just spent 10% of your advocacy organization's energy towards some of the bridging work, some of the getting to know people in community, some of the having to have productive conversations, like getting back to being, having honest conversations about it. And I'll just sort of nudge people along lovingly, because I know my community's in pain too, and I'm not going to push them into doing something that they don't feel good about. And I also think you can lead by example. I think you've got to show that it can work. I think if I'm working on several sort of strategies that I think can build greater cohesion around the issue of immigration, that can connect people in community, one of the things we found out from our research is that only 1/3 of Americans have a close personal connection to an immigrant. And that sounds surprising, but places where immigrants are growing are not the traditional gateway community. So lots of new communities that are new to immigration, they see immigrants, they know they're there, but they don't know their stories. They don't know their struggles. They don't know what's going on. And that's very human. If I don't know you, if I don't know what you've been going through, if I don't know what your struggles are, I'm not going to fight for you, right? I have to feel connected to you and I have to care about you. So anyway, the interventions that we're working on, I feel like I have to prove to everybody that they can work before I ask them to switch strategy. And so I think it's a process of bringing people in the advocacy world along to the idea of bridging is a part and a component of our work. It's not all of our work. But yeah, they're still going to fight like hell to ensure lots of important rights and opportunities. And I'm not going to slow anybody down from doing that.
Wendy, you noted that there's really room for all the people that are fighting hard on the advocacy side, the people that are focusing on the defensive side, the people that are doing bridging. Do you see that as within an organization that is about justice and advocacy, that they need to hold these different pieces? Or do you think that different organizations can be taking on different pieces of this without really worrying about the other side? So do you think bridging organizations, for example, must bring an equity lens in order to be effective? Or do you think that social justice advocacy organizations need to bring a bridging lens in order for them to be effective? Or do we simply need an ecosystem where those organizations are able to relate to each other?
Oh, I'll make a quick comment. I'd love Simone to weigh in on that. I mean, I guess both, and I think maybe you could do both. Yes, I think you should be able to do both. And the one thing that just popped into my mind is just feel like we all need to begin to learn to hold more complexity. Like the world, life is complicated. People are complicated. Just because people don't totally agree with me on everything on immigration doesn't make them a bad person. Like I just think we need to be able to be a little more comfortable with complexity. I don't know, Simone, what do you think?
Yeah, Simone.
So part of my work when I want to work with companies is that I ask them to think of themselves as quote unquote community stakeholders, that you're part of a larger ecosystem and that everything you do has a ripple effect. You have to apply an equity lens to figure out whether or not that ripple effect is going to be beneficial or harmful. I think that that's much the same thing in this space, right? We are part of larger ecosystems, and every move that we make, whether we're advocates or bridge builders, stand to affect one another. And so you do have to see and own your role in the work, but you also have to understand other people's roles in the work and be supportive of that if we're going to move together as a collective. And so I don't see any of this work as separate and apart and siloed. All of this intersects and overlaps. And I kind of want to also say, beyond just the difference between advocacy and bridge building, it's also across issue areas. When I was listening to Wendy talk about immigration, one of the things that popped into my mind, if you peel back the layers of this onion, what immigrant rights advocates are asking for is no different than what racial justice advocates are asking for, climate justice. And so, how do we start to think of ourselves as part of a larger fabric? And so if you're a part of this larger fabric, it is a both and situation for sure.
I think what I'm hearing both of you say is that the bridging community, in order to be effective, really must find ways to complexify what the work is, to be able to bring an equity lens to the work, and advocacy organizations, in order to be effective at their work and to be part of the ecosystem, also need to bring to add complexity and bring a deep understanding of how bridging works and where the bridging agenda, how that intersects with their work. Did I hear that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you were talking, this may be a very horrible metaphor, but this was the image that came into my mind. It's like trying to unlock your house door at night, right? You need both the key and some source of light to be able to see what you're doing. I see bridge building as more or less kind of the key. And advocacy work is the light, right? It helps you to open that door. And so you have to have both of those elements present to get that door open.
What a beautiful metaphor. I'm gonna borrow that. Um, Simone, Wendy talked a little bit about the risk of violence. And, you know, in addition to sort of our broadly talking about bridging and justice, we're really in this moment looking into the 22 election and then down the road to the 24 election, where a lot of folks, including a lot of people that are very experienced at sectarian violence and other kinds of political violence in other countries, are sounding an alarm, saying that Americans aren't used to thinking this way, but we have to start seeing that we're on a path toward potentially catastrophic levels of violence around our political differences. Do you see that as a really serious threat that just in and of itself needs to be identified and dealt with?
Oh, definitely. I, in a previous life, did some work with the Carter Center around pre-election violence prevention in Liberia. And it was interesting how we took a very methodical approach to like, what is the message that you're trying to shape? Who are the influencers who will disseminate this message? And like, how do you get people to focus on the positivity of civic engagement? And it was very intense and laborious. And I thought to myself, it's interesting that we can do this in other countries, but we can't see this happening in our own country, right? And so if we don't start to take a very explicit and intentional stance on like, how do we make sure that we don't devolve down the path of violence? This is a serious issue, right? This is something that, you know, not to sound like an alarmist, but this is something that we need to take into consideration. We're seeing aspects of violence play out in very piecemeal ways, but it's happening now. And so I think, you know, part of our role as bridge builders and also advocates is being able to put that on our agenda, have that top of mind as we're trying to create interventions and strategies to create change.
Boy, it's amazing how fast our time has gone. Let me ask one little provocative question. One of the things that I see a lot is that the distortions that come from political polarization. The biggest two are, one is the misattribution of motives, where we believe that our group is operating from a space of love and the other group is operating from a space of hate. And then the other distortion is moralization, where the other person isn't just opposing my perspective, they're acting immorally, even illegally, and very specifically working to destroy our democracy. And one of the challenging things that I see among the bridging community is that we see that advocates on all sides tend to fall prey to these distortions. And it's a fascinating catch-22 that without doing bridging work, it's really hard to help people confront these distortions. Do you have ideas for how people in advocacy work can specifically internalize what it means to deal with those distortions?
A hard question. Of course, you end with a hard question, David. You know, I would say that, look, it's easy to become polarized. It's easy to drawing, you know, to pick sides. It's who we are as human beings. Our brains are programmed to do it. And so I think the only way, whether it's advocates or average Joe, the only way we get out of that sort of like in-group mindset is by being exposed to people in the out group. That's the only way that's going to happen. And there's so many good ways that we can do that. And so obviously I encourage my immigration advocates to have those exposures in the ways that feel safe and comfortable for them, whether that's reading opinion pieces that don't totally agree with their worldview, whether it's viewing stories about why people might think about this issue differently, or whether it's meeting people in real time. I mean, I encourage that. And I think we all need to do this. but I think it's a process. It's just going to be a process, and it's going to take time because lots of people have become very strong in their social identity, which often is related to your politics, and that's getting harder and harder to overcome. And that's why the bridging work is really important. And just to put a point on the Simone's great light metaphor and Locke metaphor, I do think that she's totally right, that a society that understands sort of justice and bridging as codependent, not one goes before the other, but they're codependent and they help each other. I think that's a society that's going to do better than one that decides one can go and one can stay, whatever that is.
Agreed. The only thing I would add to that, because it's a brilliant answer, is I do a lot of work around nonviolent communication. And before we jump into kind of like the nuts and bolts of how to do this particular type of work, I always ask people to suspend their sense of binary, right? That there's no good, bad, right, or wrong, but like we live in this gray space, and it goes to Wendy's comment about holding space for the complexities. That if you can eschew binary, right, that there's a good side, a bad side, a left and a right, and really allow yourself to sit in the middle and hear and listen, I think that will go a long way to kind of changing our trajectory around this change work. Far too often, even within the advocacy community, there's splits and divides. And so how do we allow ourselves to one, embrace the discomfort of not having certainty, and then sit in this space with each other and just kind of delve through those hard conversations to, again, generate something new, as opposed to kind of using and rehashing the same dialogue, narrative, and tools.
Thank you. Well, we've run up against our time barrier. Is there anything else that Wendy or Simone that you want to make sure we quickly share before saying goodbye?
I think I've said enough. Just very happy to sit with you, Simone and David. Thank you for this opportunity.
Likewise.
Thanks
I just want to
go
leave
ahead,
alone.
Wendy.
I picked up in a fellowship, and it stuck with me, and it's become kind of like a driving force for how I do this work. Is one of the facilitators made a comment that every good work is not my work, and your job is to do the work is. And I would definitely encourage anyone who's either on the advocacy side or the bridge building side, figure out what your work is, right? And then acknowledge that other people are doing different work, but make sure those two things are complementary. And they're moving towards justice.
I couldn't agree more. And at Convergence, we see each of your thoughts reflected all the time in how we just finished, we're finishing a discussion on guns, and we find that people from so many different perspectives who've never sat in the same room together can both manage being strong advocates for their work and find ways to engage with each other. Simone, Wendy, thank you so much. It's been terrific. And to all of you watching, thank you for engaging with us. Enjoy Upswell. And hopefully we'll have more of this conversation at some point.